Welcome to Dialogues at Fulcrum, where we have conversations with experts and analysts on the latest geopolitical, economic, and cultural developments in Southeast Asia.
Good morning to our listeners and welcome to Dialogues at Fulcrum. My name is Julia Lau and I'm a co-coordinator of the Indonesia Studies program at the IC's Yusof Ishak Institute in Singapore. I'm also one of the editors for Fulcrum, IC's commentary and analysis website. Today, I'm very pleased to welcome two speakers to our studio, Dr. Nguyen Khac and Dr. Sophal. Giang is a visiting fellow here at ICES in the Vietnam Studies program, and he was previously a research fellow at the Vietnam Center for Economic and Strategic Studies. Sophal is a tenured associate professor at the Thunderbird School of Global Management at Arizona State University, where he lectures on global political economy, international organizations, and regional management in Asia. Happily, neither are strangers to our podcast series. Zhang did a session just past August where he spoke about Vietnam's direction under the new leadership, while Sopal talked about Cambodia's political transition last September. Broadly, our plan for today is for our speakers to delve more deeply into the topic of Vietnam-Cambodia relations, given recent developments, and we'll also talk about, big powers in relation to this. I think in IR scholarship today, it's relatively rare to see writing or even hear podcasts focusing on small states to talk about their agency and their relationships with one another. So we hope to draw some deep insight into how these two increasingly important Southeast Asian countries might respond to greater geopolitical developments and the US China rivalry now that we know who the next president of the United States will be. Very good morning and welcome to both of you. Hello, Sopal, and hello, Zhang. And we're doing this across 3 time zones.
Yeah, it's good night for me here, but out in Phoenix.
Oh, many thanks for having me. It's really a great pleasure.
All right. I think we'll start with something that happened quite recently that made some people scratch their heads. So there is something called the Cambodia-Laos-Vietnam Development Triangle Area, or CLVDTA for short. This was initiated in 1999. It was formalized in 2004. The plan is to involve 13 border provinces of Cambodia, Vietnam, and Laos. Uh, However, Cambodia withdrew from this arrangement in September. And so, one of the sort of possible reasons for this is that Cambodia and Vietnam have a complicated relationship. If they were on Facebook and in a relationship, it's complicated. Some of it involving intervention and armed conflict in the past. Some observers have claimed that the CLVDTA would result in the loss of natural resources and territory to Vietnam. But there's also a sort of complicated dynamic going on about whose idea was it, right? Who originated with this, and does this mean the ceding of sovereignty by any one of the member countries to a different, another member in that arrangement? So I'll start with this question, which is, in your view, was Cambodia's decision to withdraw from the CLVDTA politically motivated, or was it a reflection of doubt about how it can be effective in the current environment that we're in? Feel free to let me know who would like to
Yeah,
take this difficult. Okay, so Paul, let's go ahead.
I can take a
Go
crack
for
at
it.
it. I mean, the decision to withdraw from the CLVDTA seems to have been triggered by fear of protests, whether real or imagined, and the arrests of, I think, at least 100 people before they even did anything, really. I mean, it was just anticipation of potential protest. And the pressure that the authorities sensed would no doubt continue if no action was taken. So the withdrawal neutralized the protesters' main criticism, which was, well, whether conspiratorial or otherwise, that this agreement was not good for Cambodia, and so by removing it from the picture, they take away the opposition's argument about criticizing this particular agreement. And so, I mean, I think it was politically motivated. I mean, politically, this withdrawal allows Cambodia to assert its independence from Vietnam, less so Laos. Nobody's saying Laos is trying to encroach on Cambodia. appealing to domestic audiences who view such agreements with suspicion. And as well, economically, Cambodia may have questioned the agreement's efficacy. So if it wasn't, I mean, if it's since 2004 to 2024 and the results were not really noticeable, maybe it's not worth keeping. Now, of course, it sends the wrong signal to your partners when you withdraw. I compared it in one quote I gave to the press to like a kind of mini Brexit situation, but
Mm,
obviously it's far less dramatic than the Brexit. It's just that the 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 message here is that politically the authorities felt pressure and preemptively acted to withdraw, even if at least in public they kept saying like there's really nothing wrong with this agreement, there's nothing to be afraid of, but we're just going to do this in order to take away an issue from the table from the opposition.
I want to ask, so when you say not good, was there any sort of countervailing evidence from especially people who live in those border areas, that actually it has been positive, or actually it has brought growth and jobs and development in some, even if it's in a minor way?
Yeah. Well, I
Was
don't
there anyone
have
saying that?
no, I don't have the I
Mm,
didn't go there to ask the
mm,
people, or there isn't necessarily evidence one way or the other. I know that certainly the opposition would like me to say that, oh, this is terrible. This is total encroachment of Cambodian territory, but I have no evidence of that either. All I'm saying is, isn't that interesting? The authorities decide that whatever point the opposition had, we need to just take that off the table, and we'll just withdraw preemptively, and then but then we won't release these people who we claim we're going to protest. So it's like, okay, you're going to withdraw, but then you're not even going to let them go, because yeah, you have to show them who's the boss here, and the boss is you stay in jail until we say you're out. So it's just fascinating how the authorities behave. There's
I'm yeah,
cognitive dissonance in some ways.
I'm gonna jump ahead to this idea of leadership because you mentioned this thing about the boss, right? So it's a relatively new boss. Same in Vietnam, relatively new boss. And do you think that has anything to do with like what you said? You know, we'll arrest you, we'll hang on to you until you recognize us as boss, and then maybe later when things have settled down, you know. But it's just
Mm.
the new prime minister's way of showing he's in charge, or he's not gonna take things, you know.
Well, I don't want to hog the mic here, but
No, that's fine.
I will
Yeah,
simply say that for Hun Manet, the new, relatively new prime minister of Cambodia, he's still consolidating power and needs to
yeah,
show that he can behave in ways that suggest he's in charge, that he's got things under control. So
yeah,
there's no doubt in my mind that part of it is that. I mean, look at the even more recently the arrest of Mekdara, this journalist. This was totally unnecessary in terms of why draw the attention of the world's press on you like this. And then they finally let him go after they forced him to confess something on video, and it was so unnecessary. But it showed that actually the world's attention can cause the authorities to let
mm,
go of somebody once in a while. They haven't been letting go of a lot of people. They still have an old
right,
friend of mine, Terry Sang, in prison, and that's after they got, I think, 18 million released by the US after the election. So if there was any kind of idea of like, if we release this money, you'll let her go, that did not happen. They simply moved her from from the boondocks prison somewhere in the middle of nowhere where they had moved her to closer back to the capital city where she could actually get some, better treatment, or certainly have connections to the world as opposed to being out in the middle of nowhere.
right. Zhang, what are your views? In I was reading your piece on it that just came out in Fulcrum, and there was this phrase that caught my eye: "Losers all around." Uh, so,
Yeah,
what
I
are
mean,
your
like
views on?
well, from the Vietnamese perspective, the triangle was just doing just fine. You know, it's not something extraordinary. It's just a normal triangle agreements, which we actually have seen quite a lot around Southeast Asia. You know, Indonesia, Singapore, and Malaysia have this kind of triangle, and then Thailand, Singapore, Malaysia, I think also have this kind of triangle. So it's not something really like unique between, among Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos. So it's not above the ASEAN agreement. So it couldn't, bring any privilege to the Vietnamese to gain anything from, Cambodian provinces border to Vietnam. And from the Vietnamese perspective, they invested, or they pledged to invest a few billion US dollar into those border provinces across Laos and Cambodia, which might not be a big amount of money, but I think, given the relatively underdeveloped areas in those provinces, I think it's just significant for the people living there. So the Vietnamese just like couldn't really believe, like, why should you like drop this agreement, because it's basically, maybe it's not something extraordinary, but it's in any way it's a good agreement for all of those involved. And I think although we are beginning a new era, in both Phnom Penh and Hanoi with new leaders, but I think Hanoi will point the fingers to what Hun Sen, because basically this triangle was the initiative that started with Hun Sen, and it's Hun Sen's idea. It's not Vietnamese or Laos idea, building this kind of like triangle development area. And secondly, just a month before the exit of Cambodia, Hun Sen, Hun Manet, and other leaders in Phnom Penh, they made a lot of promises and made a lot of statements about how this agreement was very effective, and they continue to work with Vietnamese and Laos partners to improve, this any kind of like shortcomings of those agreements. And then suddenly, boom, like we want to exit. It's really, I think the Vietnamese feel betrayed because of that, more than the decision to withdraw. Because like if you want to withdraw, and then you might maybe deliberate more, you might want to talk to your partners about, what's going wrong, and what kind of things that you can improve. But then, after a lot of heap of praises and a lot of nice words about the agreements, and then you submitted a letter to withdraw. It's that's, for Vietnam, it's just kind of like betrayal. Especially if you look at the context of the leadership transition in Vietnam, very important, because the withdrawal came a few weeks um, after the opening ceremony of the Funan Techo Canal, which is another a concern for the Vietnamese, and just a month after the death of Vietnam's long-serving leader Nguyen Phu Trọng, who I think was seen as very close to Cambodia establishment, especially with Hun Sen. And so the new leader in Hanoi, To Lam, might see all of those actions very unfavorably. He might have some idea that maybe Phnom Penh wants to test him, or maybe want to challenge him, because he's as a new leader. Since he might not have this kind of authority that the late leader have. So these kind of things, I think, play into very complex dynamic. In Vietnamese thinking about the decision for Phnom Penh to withdraw from this agreement.
So as Zhang was speaking, the words trust and faith, reputation, right, came to my mind. But also, I don't know about you guys, but in grad school, one of the earliest readings was by one of my professors and a co-writer. Let us all praise great men. And the idea that in IR and in politics of the world, who the leader is, right? Your first level analysis, who the national leader is, can really affect things at the second and third levels of analysis. And here, both of you are talking about the national leaders who are new, needing to make some kind of impact, needing sort of both two-level game, right? Both domestically as well as regionally, if you will. And interestingly, that Zhang kept using the word betrayal, right? It's a betrayal of the ASEAN way, or whatever you call it. Earlier we had great relationships. We would speak behind closed doors. No one needs to hear all this dirty laundry being brought out. But even worse, you have made a sudden decision, right, without consulting us. Um, so maybe one way to read it is a test. It is a sort of, let me poke my spear at you and see where the vulnerabilities are, and how you might respond in kind going forward. And we can sort of jump to the canal if you want, since you brought that up as well. Do you think it's just a case of both countries have very different styles of conducting foreign policy? Which is one way to
Well,
read it.
before we jump to the canal, I'll
Sure.
say
Yeah.
that, look, I agree that prior to the sudden decision to withdraw out of the blue, the authorities would have predictably praised the Triangle Development uh, area, because this if they were being criticized about it, then they would only say positive things, and then they would bring people to the area, even, bus tours. Come on, let's go see what incredible things are happening. So yeah, I mean, what goes in my mind thinking about all this is how, let's say, a board of directors treats its CEO. The CEO is always the CEO until the CEO is no longer the CEO. So up until the very last moment, we're going to keep the CEO. This is amazing. The CEO is wonderful. And then the next thing you know, they're gone. So that's that is the behavior of the Cambodian authorities in this context. I wouldn't take it personally. I think they would not have, in my view, preferred to do this. Certainly not this way. And look, consulting deliberatively and coming to an agreement about things, that would have, I'm sure, have been preferable. But they're very domestically focused. This was for them quasi existential. I think they were that concerned about the potential for trouble that even a couple of days ago, there was a piece out of an Indian newspaper, a fortnightly newspaper, I think, or a weekend newspaper, that went into deep details about something having to do with Soros funding color revolution, and it referenced this situation. And they're trying to, I think, float a trial balloon that let's see how Washington D.C. reacts when they hear this. Maybe they'll say, "Oh my goodness, we've got to rein in the opposition," which in the article was called out as Musakua's Khmer movement for democracy, right, as being behind this. But of course, we know it's a planted article, because out of nowhere, suddenly there's a detailed piece on the intro on things happening in Cambodia in an Indian newspaper, of all things. But that's how they're behaving. They're clearly sending some sort of feelers to kind of try to see how the West might react. And on Funan Techo Canal, I would say simply that we have a situation where it's obvious. I mean, Cambodia's decision to construct it, yeah, it's a mix between economic and strategic motivations, likely with economic goals being the real driver here, because this canal is meant to enhance Cambodia's agricultural export routes. Look, everybody knows that right now Cambodia is reliant on Vietnam for exports, for getting its logistics out, and so this canal would suddenly reduce. I thought I saw something like 70+% reliance on Vietnam. So the authorities in Cambodia are
Yep.
looking at that as the driver, really. And agriculture contributes to around 22% of Cambodia's GDP. When you can get stuff out more easily, without paying tolls, without paying your neighbor, essentially, without having to rely on your neighbor, you logically want to do that, at great cost. No, notwithstanding billion, point seven, I think 1.7 billion or some such, in terms of cost for this canal, and obviously environmental considerations and all of the concerns that Vietnam has brought up aside, it is proceeding with all haste to get this constructed. But just to go back for a second on the bigger picture of why Cambodia and Vietnam behave in that way, there's historical memory. There are issues having to do with legacy, unresolved. There's the Vietnamese invasion of Cambodia. Of course, it brought Hun Sen to power, but it's also seen as an occupation. Sihanouk, the prince, then king, always said that Vietnam borders Cambodia, and with countries that border land mass wise, you can't get that close to them because they could send soldiers right across and invade you. So you can get close to China, you can get, if you want to get close to the US, but you can't get too close to Vietnam because of the shared border proximity and the problem of invasion. I don't know if he was right. He pointed that out. It obviously drives a little bit of that thinking, I'm sure.
Sure. Yeah. Would we see the Vietnamese view being very different from this? Is
Well, I
that
think I think it's quite interesting to see like across Asia. It's not only the Cambodian perspective toward the Vietnamese quite suspicious. That's similar to the way the Vietnamese feel toward the Chinese, and then the Koreans toward the Chinese. So I think it's something very infectious among nationalism in Asia. It's not only it's not just unique between Cambodians and Vietnamese. But let's come back to the triangle questions. For Vietnam, I think it's all about politics, of course. But for the Vietnamese, they felt that let's say Cambodia under Hun Sen is extremely authoritarian and really tightly controlled regime, and I think Hanoi doesn't really buy the idea that Phnom Penh withdrew from the triangle because of domestic pressure. Because if it actually domestic pressure, and then it could be a really nice tune for the opposition to use it again. Maybe raising some other public problems and then protest and then demand some more concession from Hun Sen or Hun Manet. So I think for a leader like Hun Sen, who really really strong man and ruled Cambodia for decades and was determined to dismantle the second largest political party in Cambodia, and how could he really like succumb to pressure from oppositions? And secondly, for the Vietnamese, it's not about domestic politics. They believe that Hun Sen is strong enough to crack down on any kind of oppositions if he really wanted to do. And so for the Vietnamese, if they look from the perspective of the triangle withdrawal and the Funan Techo Canal project and the Ream naval base, it's about foreign policy more than about domestic politics. It's about Cambodia signaling the desire to have more strategic autonomy, and in such regard, they move closer to China. And for Vietnam, it is a more pressing issue and is more concerning because if Cambodia becomes closer to China, Laos become closer to China, and then Vietnam would be contained, three sides, actually four sides. China on the north, the South China Sea disputes, always there with the nine dash line, Laos and Cambodia. So I think the Vietnamese is worried because of that. It's not, not because of the whatever narrative that Hun Sen and Hun Manet, brought in when they declare, the withdrawal from the triangle. So I think it's really complicated for Vietnam in terms of geopolitical calculation. Historical, memories play a very important role. But what is more pressing for Vietnam now is such geopolitical risks if Cambodia continues to carry out its policies with some relevance to the Vietnamese, like the building of the Funan Techo project without any consultation with the Vietnamese side, and it's I think it's more kept like add more songs to injury for the Vietnamese because it's not the first time that Vietnam has the problems with neighboring for policies in building projects which might be seen as harmful for Vietnamese national interests. Laos already built a lot of hydro power dams on the mainstream river, Mekong River, and the approach that Vietnam did with Laos was that they just asked for more consultation. It's not like they prevented Laos from building Sayaburi Dam, but in the end, Laos built that dam, but with consultation, with more proper environmental assessments. So what Vietnam needs from Cambodia is not that you stop building that canal, to stop giving the Chinese the naval base, or to stop Vietnamese investment in those border provinces. But what they need is more deliberation, more consultations, and I think exactly what Vietnam feel. Why Vietnamese in Hanoi might feel it's not really a nice action from Phnom Penh to just suddenly declare the withdrawal without any consultation to its partners.
I think looking at, the other so-called triangular relationships in the rest of ASEAN or Southeast Asia, the historical memory part of it is not as recent and not as strong and not as long-standing and complicated what we see between or among Laos, Cambodia, and Vietnam compared to, say, Singapore, Malaysia, and Indonesia, where there's established cooperation on maritime security and other things. And also there are, I think there's a different dynamic if it's mainland Southeast Asia versus maritime Southeast Asia. The concerns are very different in some ways because if you're maritime, then you're looking at really transnational, threats like crime, piracy, smuggling. Um, Whereas the mainland, you know, triangles are sort of more complicated by this idea of past invasion, past historical memory, as you both pointed out. Let's turn now to we had ideas about talking about new leadership, and both of you have touched on it. I'll just give you that question on continuity or disruption. So now, given all this, right, given all that we've talked about, all these tensions, Cambodia wanting, to push for more autonomy, Vietnam not necessarily liking how it's done, and what has been done. Do you think in the short term, let's say the next 1 to 2 to 3 years, will there be more disruption as Cambodia tries to, assert its own agency more? And I'll let Zhang start maybe from Vietnam's point of view. Since his leader is, or Vietnam's leader is newer, what do you know so far? And it may be hard to tell, partly because it is Vietnam.
Well, I mean, Vietnam it remains a one-party communist state, so I think
Mm.
it's the new
Right.
leader represent continuity more than disruption. And if you
Yeah.
look at the way that the new leader Tolam has conducted his both domestic and foreign policies, I think it represents quite strong desire to maintain Vietnam's continuity in both domestic and foreign policy fronts. But I think there are slight differences in the way that he will carry out foreign policy, and especially with regards to neighborhood policy. Because Tolam is he's a new generation. He's not the one who established himself during the Vietnam War. He's the post Vietnam War generation. So he doesn't really have really strong personal connection with the current leaders in both Phnom Penh or Vientiane. So I think that plays very importantly in the way that he might carry out his foreign policy. Vietnam under the late leader Nguyen Phu Trọng was very intimate toward Phnom Penh, especially he had his personal connection with Hun Sen. But Tolam doesn't have that kind of personal connection. So he, as a more pragmatic leader, he might be more vocal in asserting Vietnamese national interests and in dealing with foreign partners, and especially given the recent example of Vietnam being quite vocal about China Coast Guard's attack on Vietnamese fishermen on the South China Sea, despite the fact that Vietnam-China relations have been quite good for the past few years, and despite the fact that Tolam visited China, you know, um, just 2 weeks into his new tenure as the chief of the Vietnamese Communist Party. So I think Tolam might be more pragmatic and might be more vocal, and that might present, I think, as something like a, let's say, maybe a risk somehow if there are more tensions or there are more concerns from the Vietnamese side in the way that regional policies are being conducted, which might be harmful to Vietnam national interest. But secondly, I think as a pragmatic leader, Tolam might be more willing to negotiate. If you have a good deal, and then why not? And so I think it's the new leadership in Vietnam. First, there would be continuity in terms of maintaining the same way that Vietnam carry out domestic and foreign policy. And secondly, it might present a new opportunity for both Vietnam and Cambodia to think about how to move forward with, with the new neighborhood policies in a way that emphasize equality and also emphasize the national interests of both countries. And the third, I think, is also a good a good topic to transition to the next question about Vietnam might be worried more about other topics and other partners instead of just focusing on Cambodia, because with the new election in US, Vietnam would be very concerned about how to maintain its position in between the great power rivalries between US and China, especially with a lot of risks ahead for Vietnam in terms of trade policy that Trump might have when he becomes the next president. After January 2025. So I think all of those dynamics will play really, a very complex way in consideration for the bilateral tie between Vietnam and Cambodia for the next few years to come.
Before I release you, do you think Vietnam has ambitions to be the regional hegemon? I mean, I know China's looking about, but like, in terms of just mainland Southeast Asia, do you think that's already what it sees itself as, and that's why these moves by Cambodia are so upsetting?
So I think during the Cold War, I think Vietnam definitely wanted to be a regional hegemon in a way that Russia or the former Soviet Union wanted to be, kind of like a big brother in the Eurasia region. But I think for now, Vietnam just wanted to really have a secure, let's say, buffer zone in Cambodia and Laos. Like I say, Vietnam um, is really feel being contained by pressure from China, especially given all of those problems on the South China Sea, and then only the only two other neighbors that Vietnam have is Laos and Cambodia, and Vietnam wants to secure that front, because if Laos and Cambodia become really tie into the Chinese orbit, and then Vietnam will feel a little bit threatened by that pressure. And the historical precedence doesn't really plays nicely with Vietnam on that front, because the last time Vietnam had a war was the war in two fronts, in the southern front with Khmer Rouge, and then in the northern front with the Chinese, which supported Khmer Rouge. So Vietnam always feel really threatened you know uh, by security concern if its neighbors are not really at least independent from interference from any other countries. And so the foreign policy that Vietnam has been consistently carrying out in the past few decades after the đổi mới, the reform policy, is that they want to secure their neighborhood with Cambodia and Laos if they are not really Vietnam allies, and then must be something like very friendly neighbors for Vietnam. And that's why they pour a lot of money and investment with limited resources, as middle countries like middle powers like Vietnam posing. They pour a lot of money into Laos and Cambodia because of that.
All right, so Paul, we're turning to you for the
Right.
sort of other. I don't want to make it oppositional though. So if you have, and there's a lot to unpack. If you want to
Yeah.
go sort of point by
Well,
point.
I was still thinking about your original question of the,
Mm,
next couple of years, right? So
mm, yep.
I don't think there's going to be anything dramatically changed in Cambodia's position. I mean, we know, for example, that when Hun Sen first came to power, thanks to Vietnam, and we say, Vietnam invaded Cambodia, but China won Cambodia. That basically Hun Sen called China the root of all evil, right? And then the guy shifts over by 2017 to, ironclad friends and stops hedging at all and embraces Beijing completely. So it takes a while, but it's very clear the direction of this shift. And then now we're in 2024. It's been 7 years. Is there going to be another shift from a great power? Dynamics viewpoint, I think there's a possibility that Cambodia realizes its economy isn't doing so well. China has not been the sugar daddy that it has been over the last decade. Maybe things are not looking so great. Maybe the cyber scams, slave compounds are becoming less reliably profitable. I don't know. They certainly have given Cambodia a black eye. Not that Cambodia has stopped using them, but it's certainly not brought good press to Cambodia. But there's a sense that maybe there's an opening for dialogue that wasn't there before. Maybe Angkor Sentinel could resume, will resume. There's even talk of some preliminary exercises or activities that the U.S. and Cambodia could undertake. Does that mean there's another shift and Cambodia is now opened up to the West? I don't know. I tend to think that with respect to Vietnam, a cigar really is a cigar in this case. I don't think that they want to necessarily, in the case of the triangle situation, that they wanted to specifically insult anybody, that it was really domestic politics. But it's true. I mean, it shows a lack of respect, a lack of understanding of Big Brother Vietnam in that sense. After all that Cambodia received, or after all the regime got from Vietnam, to not give due consultation and regard to Hanoi in its decision. It is most unfortunate. Will there be more of that going forward? I don't know how many more agreements they can trample upon or insult Hanoi about, but I would say it's probably going to be a good time to try to patch things up and spend more quality time with To Lam, just because there hasn't been that relationship with the previous leader. If Cambodia is interested in mending fences, if Phnom Penh is interested in that sense, it needs to invest more in building that trust and rebuilding the trust. Because we all know, trust takes a long time to build, but can crumble overnight. So that's the challenge. And look, I don't know whether they'll invest that, whether it's worth it for them to do that. I think that it would make sense if they tried to, given the sensitivities involved in what just happened in the situation. So I would predict that Hun Manet and his father have got to go spend more time trying to mend fences. And if they do that, things will be better for their relationship, not necessarily for the people of Cambodia, but certainly for their relationship with Hanoi.
Yeah, that's a good point. One of the ways at least Singapore and Indonesia and Malaysia do it is the outgoing leader always brings along the incoming one once they know who it is, to 4-eye or 8-eye retreats, and they talk behind closed doors. They share a meal. They go to each other's official homes or whatever, play golf, and it does take time. It doesn't guarantee trust, but at least you know who the other person is, and it may or may not be easier to pick up the phone and just say, "Hey, let's chat about this and let our people work it out." But do you think? And we started with a short-term question, but in a way, do you think in several more decades, some of these tensions would just in the course of time, right? Like Zhang was saying, the new leader in Vietnam hasn't had that kind of experience, so he is in a way more pragmatic. He can do something slightly different. So even if both are sort of status quo uh, leaders, or don't want to make any sort of wild moves, incrementally over time, over 10, 20, 30, 40 years, someday Vietnam-Cambodia relations may come to a more cordial state. It's not that it's not cordial now, but that I think Cambodia is really trying to assert agency, and it's being regarded with some alarm by the Vietnamese.
Yeah, no, I think there's so much more than even the Vietnamese invasion of Cambodia of 1979, right? I mean, it goes back to the history of the tales of why did the Khmer Rouge, who were communists, and the Vietnamese who were communists, why did they not see eye to eye? Well, because of nationalism, of course. Because of historical animus. The stories told of wow, of brewing tea on Cambodian heads, for example. These are the kinds of stories that animate Cambodian nationalism, whether completely fictitious or not. Or even in the Khmer language, the word Nguyen, which is the word for Vietnamese, is seen as insulting, which it can be certainly, but it's also used as the Vietnamese sweet and sour soup. So if you hate that soup so much, why would you keep ordering salami to you and all the time to your table? So then it's fascinating because it is this love hate thing. It is, and it will take, I think, more than decades. Really, it may never, in fact, be resolved so long as you have two nations bordering one another in that way, and the misunderstandings, which whether based on historical animus that can ever be resolved, or among leaders. And by the way, I do hope that in 20, 30 years it would be different leaders in charge, right? By then, so that there could be more understanding between the peoples of Cambodia and the people of Vietnam, because there's no benefit in hatred. It's simply, look, Cambodia has on its west Thailand, and the Thais also have, there's also been terrible misunderstandings, and then there was the burning of the Thai embassy because of the first incidents of like viral fake propaganda over social media, over email, so it's fascinating, but it's discouraging as to how humanity can behave at times, right? Even if you share the same ideology, if you're not from the same country, that makes you enemies, and that doesn't benefit anybody.
Right. Good point. And I would like to say always, if someone says 20, 30 years, one sort of good thing is it won't be my job. Preferably also not, well, you're both, maybe still going as academics, but I think you raise really good points about how nationalism gets in the way, right? Despite both sides, wanting to make friends and wanting to sort of jointly cooperate to develop. So we'll sort of flip the order since we've talked about the love-hate relationship at some length. Um, Zhang mentioned Trump already. Up to you if you want to talk about both, relationships with China vis-a-vis Cambodia and Vietnam, and then with the US going forward. Now that we know, and we're actually, day by day seeing more and more appointments of the new administration coming in January next year in the United States. It's going to be a very different slate in a way from what's sitting there right now under Biden. Although I think some fundamentals won't change, and I think some people in Southeast Asia may actually misunderstand. Biden has also been tough on certain issues that Trump actually may not be as tough on, right? Or may be distracted by other things on. How do you see for the country that you study? How do you see these countries hedging or balancing, or what will they do in terms of geopolitics to manage this dynamic?
No, I think,
Well,
yeah.
go
Sorry,
ahead,
Zhang,
go ahead, Jiang.
let's do Zhang first then, and
Yeah.
then
Right. Well, I think for Vietnam, it would be incredibly busy months ahead for Vietnamese policymakers to think about different scenarios in the new administration, especially with regards to geopolitical implications. The way that U.S. might behave towards the South China Sea dispute, the way that it might behave toward the trade war with China, it all have a huge implications for Vietnamese foreign policy. First is about the trade, of course. Like I said, Vietnam has a huge trade surplus with the U.S. I think the third highest, only after China and Mexico. So there could be a huge risk for Vietnam to be punished by tariff by Trump. In 2019, Trump labeled Vietnam as a single words trade abuser, and that designation only disappeared when Vietnam committed to buy a dozens of billions of US dollar worth of goods from US. But now with the time come, it's much harder for Vietnam to find things that they can buy from US, to compensate for a huge, I think, over 100 billion US dollars of trade deficit between Vietnam and US. So it's getting much harder for Vietnam to accommodate to maybe a new tariff threat from Trump. So that is the first, I think, policy priorities that Vietnam must really consider, really think really hard now. And secondly, about the South China Sea dispute, and we will know that Vietnam benefits quite a lot when U.S. is more interested in getting involved in the South China Sea dispute, because otherwise it's really hard for countries like Vietnam or the Philippines to balance against the rising influence from China. That with Trump, with a more transactional approach, like what next? Whether Trump would trade the South China Sea dispute with some deals with China over trade, or some deals with China over Taiwan. All of those uncertainties, I think, would be extremely important for Vietnam to consider for the next couple of years. And what Vietnam needs least now is more tensions with Cambodia or with Laos or with other neighboring countries over that, because the priorities now must be how to deal with the upcoming uncertainties over regional geopolitical landscape. So I think for Vietnam now, they really wants, like Sophal said, they really wants to have a stable neighborhood similar to the way the Cambodia or Laos might want with Vietnam. So I think with the upcoming Trump administration, Vietnam might want to stabilize more over its neighborhood policies. And so I don't think there would be a risk of, let's say, escalating tensions between Cambodia and Laos and Vietnam over a couple of years because of that. But what happened, after that might be a big question.
Yeah.
Sophal?
Well, I mean, I hearken back to 2016 when Trump first won, and how Hun Sen, then Prime Minister, was had rooted for him from before the election, did a victory lap after the election, got me involved in the whole thing because I was just a commentator. I was just making comments, and so I got pulled into this whole strange saga. But I have noted how silent things have been since Trump's. There certainly was not a explicit demand or lobbying for Trump's victory before this election. I did not, if there was, I did not notice it. Um, because at the time, Hun Sen in 2016 was saying Trump is going to bring world peace, and it'll all be business and wonderful. And then, Cambodia got clobbered on the head for being too close to China, which it risks again being, if seen as a friend of Beijing. And of course, that puts you in this awkward position where you're seen as too close to, but you could also be a vessel for China to export more efficiently through you. In other words, offshore to Cambodia, and then export to the United States with a Made in Cambodia label. I think bicycles, certainly now garments, and by way of trade deficit, we're an order of magnitude less than Vietnam. If there's a trade deficit of 100 billion with the U.S., between Vietnam and the U.S., for Cambodia, the U.S. trade deficit is 11.8 billion in 2022. So small potato, certainly not number three or anywhere near number three from that standpoint. But still, the friendship with Beijing, the proximity to Beijing, if it continues unabated or if it is unvarnished, would draw the ire of hawks like Marco Rubio as Secretary of State, and others who see Cambodia as just another pawn in China's great game. So that's a risk. That's the kind of risk one attracts in that situation. Unlike under the Biden administration, democracy, human rights, freedom, and all these things. I don't expect that there would be, and there wasn't in 2016, 2020, a lot of talk about that, even if it was couched in the kind of language that might sound like that. Well, Mike Pompeo might say something like that as Secretary of State back then, but we knew that the real reason was China. And look, they're being naked about it, but they use it as that reason. And so, in that sense, for this next 4 years, I imagine that there will be, if there are instances of encounters between the U.S. and Cambodia, it would be around China, whether it's the cyber slave compounds, which of course draw the ire of the U.S. because anything that causes Americans to lose millions of dollars through scams will draw the attention of the authorities, and then it'll ensnare Cambodia in that whole sort of dialogue. But I think be careful what you wish for. Hun Sen wanted Trump to win last time. Now we're not hearing much of that because I think he understands that the reality is that a Trump presidency can be less than what he expected, or far more than what he expected, by way of trouble for the Cambodian authorities. And that's really the reality of a Trump presidency, to be honest.
That's a diplomatic way of putting it. I wanted to ask, do you think Cambodia has done enough to show that it has agency, that it's not? I think that's the sort of the lot of a small country, right? Where people assume, you're gonna be somebody's pawn, like you said. Do you think
Yeah.
Cambodia, will double down and do even more going forward, just to show I'm not China. I'm not going to just do what China wants me to do, which is how some people interpret some of these recent moves.
It may be, although I don't know that that it was because they thought Trump was going to win. Now that he has won, I think it might be to their incentive to do even more of that, to clearly delineate, and if anything, to maybe even play the. Well, they used to play the anti-terrorism game, which was okay. We welcome America on any anti-terrorism effort. Uh, in fact, I note that the CIA officer was just arrested in Cambodia in the Israel-Iran leaked documents situation. That is clearly, putting Cambodia in the limelight for uh, basically coincidental reasons. But I'm sure that the messaging or the understanding has got to be, for Phnom Penh at least, look more like you're okay with perhaps resuming relations at a higher level with the United States than you did in the past. If you were considering, a lower amount, reconsider, so that Trump and his administration can see you as your own agent and perhaps still at play, as opposed to completely in the pocket of China.
Yeah, that's a good point. For those who are curious about what we're talking about, there is a Jerusalem Post article posted up about half a day ago, um, about this CIA official, Rahman, who was working for the CIA overseas, and apparently uh, these classified documents were circulated on Telegram, and the U.S. authorities are not sure where the documents came from, but he's been arrested in Cambodia, and he was brought to a federal court in Guam to face charges. Uh, all right, we will end. I'm trying to decide whether to end on a hopeful or not hopeful note. I think maybe a broad question about, you know will relations between Cambodia and Vietnam ride out the Trump presidency? And I suppose we can assume the basic answer is yes, because we've survived one round of it before. Uh, but what do you think would be the best thing each country can do, either vis-a-vis each other bilaterally, or in ASEAN, or through ASEAN, which is another possibility, vis-a-vis China and the US? So far to start, I guess, since we'll
Right.
take it the
Yeah.
other way
Well,
around.
I think that if the message is fierce, or at the very least increasing independence exercised by Cambodia, with respect to its relationship with China, with respect to its relationship with Vietnam, this would be a positive thing. This would be a positive thing for the Cambodian people. I don't know if it would be seen as a positive thing for Hanoi necessarily, if it's like, hey, wait a minute, you're not doing what we expect you to do, but it would show at least the ability to act as your own agent and not as the agent of somebody else, and that from a balancing perspective, the Cambodian regime can then curry favor from Washington D.C. Because after all, as a small state, Cambodia only goes around basically trying to align itself and get benefits from those nations, right? So it gets money from China. It tries to play that game with the U.S. There's obviously less money, but there's trade, lots of trade, and lots of foreign exchange from that standpoint. With Vietnam, Vietnam can shower Cambodia with money, but it can't compete, in my view, with the levels of Chinese money, and the just the orders of magnitude involved. But still, you don't want bad relations with your immediate neighbor. So how do you balance all of that? And I would say the best thing the Cambodian authorities can do for the next few years is to try to navigate that, and to thread that needle in a way that allows Cambodia to exercise its independence and show that it is Neither, it is not on anybody's side. It is not on anybody's particular, in any particular pocket, but rather fiercely for itself.
Yeah, I agree with that, and I wanted to thank you. I think you're the first person to use the phrase "sugar daddy" to describe China on any podcast. Zhang,
Well, I would try
what are
to.
your thoughts?
I will definitely use that word like
Sugar
again in
daddy.
yeah, in my commentary about Chinese influence over Southeast Asia. But seriously, I think I think both Cambodia and Vietnam are small middle countries, and like a motto, hedgers of the world unite. I think it's important for Vietnam and Cambodia to stabilize the bilateral tie despite all of those differences in, perceptions about national interests and concerns. And I think there are a lot of ways for them to do so. Currently, the Vietnamese and the Cambodian authorities are building highways that connecting Ho Chi Minh City, which is a Vietnamese economic hub with Phnom Penh, and there are some plans as well to build some economic zones, alongside the borders. I think it's important to have more economic connection between the two because obviously, as neighboring countries, is and as with a quite good logistic infrastructure across the borders, it's important to have more economic collaboration than less because when you have more economic kind of like entangled economic interests, we might think positively more about each other. And I think secondly, and more importantly, it's important for Vietnam and Cambodia to interact more in multilateral frameworks and with more external partners, especially trusted partners like Japan and South Korea, because in so doing, I think it will help Phnom Penh eliminate any perception of Vietnam being kind of like big brother and forcing policies over Cambodia. If you have like external partners like Japan and South Korea coming in and so jointly develop economic policies across the border, and also as smart hedgers like Vietnam, Cambodia, it's important to enhance multilateral connection in the world that with I think more American isolationism and less American input in multilateral institutions. It's important for them to stick together and to be to be unified in multilateral framework to protect their own interests. And just one more interesting information that I want to ask is that a few weeks before Trump's re-election, Trump organization got their project approved in Hanoi, a province close to Hanoi, to build a 1.5 billion US dollar compound in Tolam's hometown. So there would be a Trump organization tower somehow in Hanoi, and that's kind of like I think both Vietnam and Cambodia are capable of making such kind of like um, rapprochement in the way to accommodate Trump 2.0. So I think I'm still kind of have positive feelings about how Vietnam and Phnom Penh can navigate the upcoming uncertainties in the next couple of years quite nicely, like we both did quite well during the first Trump administration. But of course, let the future unfold, and we potentially would have another Fulcrum discussions maybe in 3 years to talk more about that.
Definitely, maybe even in person in a
Sooner than that.
seminar or something. Yeah. Well, thank you both very much for your time. I appreciate all the insights. It's been a good learning journey for me as well because we really do very rarely get to hear insights into these two countries specifically, right? Without the shadow of the big powers getting involved. And I think resilience is also something that Zhang's answer speaks to. I think as a region, Southeast Asia can afford to be more resilient. And one of those ways is to build better and stronger bilateral ties among all the different members of ASEAN in case misunderstandings occur, which they will. So thank you both. Good luck with all the teaching and other things and writing that you have to do. I hope you do come back someday for another podcast, maybe or maybe not about the same topic. Thank you very much for joining me today.
Thank you for joining us in our conversation on Dialogues at Fulcrum. If you want to access more of our analysis on Southeast Asia, please check out fulcrum.sg. Dialogues at Fulcrum is brought to you by the ISIS Yusof Ishak Institute. We look forward to sharing more insightful conversations with you in subsequent episodes. See you then!